key to what we're all about. And it's the thing that defines us apart from every other denomination. And there's some pretty progressive churches in Australia now, I know that. There's some fabulous Uniting Church parishes and Anglican parishes and Roman Catholic parishes and Baptists and doing wonderful things. But not one of them accepts us 100% exactly the way we are and celebrates who we are through a covenant relationships and through recognising and allowing us to love and to be fully involved right up to the level of ordination in the churches. MCC is the place that does that, and that was started by Reverend Troy Perry way back in 1968. Now, I grew up as a good Methodist boy. We got any Wesleyan hymns tonight? Who's no Wesleyan hymns? We might have to hum one later on. I might have, my phone may have one with Christian soldiers on it or something. But I grew up a good Methodist boy, and I know my mum and dad were very progressive back in those days, and very involved in social justice and community issues, particularly back then in the early 60s, late 50s. Social justice were issues like women's issues, Aboriginal Australian issues. This was before Aboriginal Australians, Native Australians even had the right to own land or have a vote. And these were sorts of issues that I grew up sort of involved in. And eventually, as I got a little bit older, I started to become a little bit girly. I'm really butch and rugged now, but back then when I was young, I started to get a little bit girly. And one of the elders of the church said to Dad, look, we really don't think Greg should come to church anymore. And Dad was stunned. And he said to the elder, he said, well, we better call a meeting of the Board of Elders and talk about this. And so they did. And they said, we think your son is a homosexual. And they used to say homosexual, queer. Homosexual was the word they used back then. And we don't think it's right that he come to church. And my dad looked at the Board of Elders and he said, well, if you don't have him, you don't have me. And that was the day that he walked out of the church as well. For me, it meant very little back then. I was a teenager. I was growing up, I was involved in life, and nothing like today, but life back then was good. They're fabulous things. The gay community was just starting to, we had little bars where you could go and have a quiet coffee in a back lane in King's Cross, and provided the police didn't come, you could sort of meet people. But there was nowhere to go to church. My dad, sadly, never went back to the church. And so, even more sadly, he never lived long enough to experience MCC. But I can remember back in that little Methodist church in Epping, it's Oxford Street in Epping, it's still there, it's still a United Church, and I actually performed my grandmother's funeral in that church, which was just the most fabulous coming home for me. But in the Sunday school, above the stage in the Sunday school, and we used to have 1,200 kids in the church Sunday school. This was back in the good old Bible Belt. This is the days when you went to Sunday school, you didn't have a choice. And above the stage in the Sunday school, it said simply, for God so loved the world. For God so loved the world. If you look at some of the older translations, tonight's reading starts that way. For God so loved the world that God sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but should have everlasting life. And God sent his Son into the world not to condemn the world, but that through him the world may be saved. And I'd forgotten about that until one night, back in the early 80s, Deacon Rod Bavaro, who was a member of MCC and also a member of the Roo Bike Club, which was the gay motorbike club. Told you I was butch. Noel was a member of the Roo Bike Club. There's not many of us left, is there? No. Not many of us that can remember anyway. And Rod said to me, why don't you come to church one night? And I thought, oh yeah, in your dreams. But Rod persisted and persisted and persisted. And one night I found myself at the Paddington Church up in Oxford Street where MCC was meeting. And I walked in the door and I sat down, and Reverend Jim Dykes was the pastor back then. And that night Reverend Jim was preaching on John 3:16 and 17. Now I don't know what happened that night. I don't remember much of that night. I do remember we sang "And Can It Be" at the end, which just was fabulous. But I can remember feeling the Spirit of the Lord being in that place and around that place and taking hold of me and just embracing me in a way I hadn't experienced since my childhood. I think from that day, I missed 2 or 3 MCC services ever since when I've been in Australia. And Reverend Jim Dykes said to me one day, he said, "Greg, have you ever thought of the ministry?" I said, no, I'm happy just being a church clerk, thank you very much. He said, "Well, Reverend Troy Perry's coming out." This is 1986. And Reverend Troy Perry's coming out and I'd like you to meet him. And Reverend Troy came and Jim organised for us to have lunch. And we had lunch at the Mexican restaurant down near St Vincent's Hospital. And Troy is bigger than life. Who's met Troy? Come on, he's bigger than life. Troy is just, I wish he could come here and speak to you. Yeah? He is just bigger than life. And we were sitting at dinner and he looked at me and said, "Well, when are you coming to the United States?" And I said, "Why would I want to go there?" And he looked a bit shocked. He said, "No," he said, "Don't you want to come to the US?" I said, "No, I don't ever want to go to the US." Part of my growing up was being in the Australian Air Force, and I'd spent some time in Vietnam, and my feeling towards some of our American brothers in particular weren't very, very compassionate. He said, "Greg, let me tell you this. You will come to the US, and it will happen sooner than you expect." Well, 3 years later, I finished seminary at the United Theological College. While I was pastoring the church as lay pastor as well, as Reverend Jim Dykes had resigned. 4 years later, I was the district coordinator for Australia. And I was in Los Angeles at my very first General Council meeting of MCC. And over the next 9 years, 2 and 3 times a year, I hopped on that aeroplane and I flew to Los Angeles. And every single time I arrived, Reverend Troy would say, "I told you so. I told you so." But on the journey, I've learnt something very, very special about MCC. And it revolves around our 3-pronged gospel message: Christian salvation, Christian community, and Christian social justice. The driving force of who we are. And for those of us who've been here for a while, and I look at you, Peter, and Carlos. I can remember when these two first met, and the day that Carlos arrived. And I remember he was standing on the steps of the church at Paddington with Peter that first night that Peter brought him to church, with his cowboy boots on. Looking so American. But, what I learned is that to be Christian and to truly live out your faith is to truly embrace that 3-pronged gospel that MCC was founded on.